Welcome everyone to At Home with Theosophy. We are going to explore the subject of life after death. This is a second series, and in the first series that we had in February, we looked into the first stage after death, and we are going to do a recap here for those who did not participate in that series. And then this is the second and final series. If you have not participated in the first one, you are not going to need it for this series. The subjects are quite independent of each other, even though they follow in a sequence, as we are going to see. The whole course is based on a book by Annie Besant that is called Death and After. It's the last half of the book. The first half we explored it in the previous series. I rearranged them. You won't find them in the same way that I'm presenting them here, because Annie Besant repeats the subject in different chapters, so I have rearranged the material so that we can explore subject by subject in these four classes. So let us start with the review in the process of death, what we have explored in the previous series. First, when talking about this, it is necessary to have a certain sense of the human constitution as explained by the Theosophical tradition. Normally, in Christianity, there is the idea, for example, that we are a body and a soul. Some early Christians had divided the human being in three aspects: body, soul, and spirit. Today, most people don't know the difference between the spirit and the soul. And this is fine for general purposes to understand what happens after death. But if we want to understand things in more detail, in a more comprehensive way, we need to look at the human constitution in a more detailed way. So the Theosophical tradition presents 7 different aspects for a human being that can be grouped into 2 main categories. As you see there on the table on your left, and we have a category that says the immortal triad. This is a group of 3 principles, 3 spiritual aspects or dimensions of a human being, which is immortal. That means these are not affected by life and death. They remain throughout the whole cycle of reincarnation, because in the Theosophical view, we are not born and die only once, but we do it repeatedly. As we are going to say we do so with a specific purpose. So the 3 higher aspects or dimensions of a human being are spiritual and they are immortal. And then we have what Annie Besant calls the perishable quaternary. Quaternary means fourfold, 4 aspects, and these are perishable, these are transient. And these are aspects that are born in a particular lifetime, and then they die before a new incarnation begins. So these 4 aspects are particular of a period of a particular life and the afterlife, as we are going to see. Many times you will see in the Theosophical literature that the immortal triad is called the individual, the true individual, while the lower quaternary is called the person or the personality. The word personality comes from, I think it is a Greek or maybe the Latin, that for mask. It's from persona. Sona is sound and per is through which. So persona is that through which the sound comes, because when they would do plays, they would use masks, and then the sound was coming through the mask. So I think this is quite appropriate. Our personality, we are going to see the composition of it, is just a mask of the true individual, that is the actor, that if for the different plays puts on a different mask, a different persona. So the higher aspect of ourselves, which is the immortal aspect, is constituted by three principles. The source of will as a spiritual will, the will that we normally are aware of is more a form of desire. This is the will that makes us engage in the world and go through the process of incarnation and develop our divine nature, etc. You will see in Theosophical literature that Sanskrit words are used for most of these principles, because there are no good words in English or in modern languages. So Atma is the word used for this highest principle in us. Atma means self, but Atma is a universal self, a divine self. This is, at the level of Atma, there is unity. We are all manifestations of the one self. Then we have the next principle, intuition. It's referring mostly to spiritual intuition, not the intuition as a gut feeling, for example. The word intuition means inner knowledge, and intuition means the ability to have a certain knowledge that did not come by means of a process of thinking. The intuition is a more direct knowledge. There is a lower intuition that is, for example, in Western philosophy, they will say that the information that we get through the senses, sometimes they call it an intuition, before the mind begins to label that information, to arrange that information. So we get an immediate knowledge of the world, and then the mind begins to interpret it. Sometimes the interpretation is correct, sometimes it is not. Sometimes there is a simple fact that our minds, because of previous experience, of conditioning, etc., interprets in a way that will make that fact upsetting to us, for example. But perhaps this fact, as it comes from the senses, the pure perceptions, is neither good nor bad. So there is that direct knowledge through the senses before the mind is involved. That is a kind of lower intuition. The intuition of the higher nature is a spiritual intuition, which is a direct perception that happens beyond the process of thinking. And the Sanskrit word for this is buddhi. Buddhi is a word that comes from the same root as the word Buddha. The Buddha is the enlightened one. So buddhi is the source of enlightenment in us. And then we have the principle of manas. Manas means mind, that it's the aspect in ourselves that develops the capacity to conceive of the universe, to understand the universe, not in that direct way as the intuition, but understand the universe in terms of images, concepts. The Buddhic intuition normally works more at the level of the essences, of the formless, of unity. But when we come to the world of differentiation, separation, we need a kind of consciousness that is able to cognize, to recognize, to perceive the differences. And that is what manas allows. There is a higher aspect of manas that is part of the immortal individuality. And then that is what we may call a spiritual mind. When all these three principles express themselves on the physical, on the lower planes, let's say, not only the physical plane, but express themselves through a personality, then that higher mind is, and sometimes it is said, emanates a fragment of itself, a ray of itself, to become the mind of the new personality. The regular mind we use is a very small fragment of our true spiritual mind. It's a very small fragment because it's limited by the brain, by the body, by the senses. Our true mind beyond the body is far wiser, far more wise, can understand far more. I can go into definitions, too much definitions, but the idea is that the higher mind is quite an enlightened mind when compared to the mind that we are using every day, and that is the lower mind. And the lower mind, one of the qualities is that the lower mind works entangled with our desire nature. In Sanskrit, kama. Kama means desire. So many times our thought is conditioned by our desire. Our perception is conditioned by our desires. By desire, we include also fear, ambition, pride, all the ideas that the lower emotions come from this personal principle, kama, while the higher emotions, love, compassion, etc., they all come from the higher nature. So the lower mind normally works entangled with desire. That's why many of our opinions are not based on facts. They are based on what we like or dislike, or how we would like things to be, or how we dislike things to be. So in humanity, the mental process many times is heavily influenced by the emotional nature. And then the last two principles, the etheric double and the dense body, they form the physical body, the body, the material body that we are aware of, which the denser part that we can perceive with our five senses has a subtler counterpart, which is the vehicle for what we can call life or vitality. Again, we don't need to go into details. Now, what is important for us is to look at this in terms of the different states of consciousness that we are going to go through as we go through what we call death. So let's see this defined in a slightly different way. We see the Sanskrit words, they are all the same. But now let us define or translate these principles in terms of the reincarnating soul. So the highest principle, Atman, is the self, the universal self, the divine self in us. Buddhi is called spiritual soul, which is the self is also sometimes called the spirit, the universal spirit, the divine spirit in us. And the spiritual soul is the first expression of that universal self or spirit, which expresses itself as this intuition, spiritual intuition. And then the higher manas, the spiritual mind, that is the aspect that reincarnates. That is what we call in Theosophy the reincarnating soul. So remember those three principles you see there are the immortal principles, the ones that remain throughout the cycle of incarnation. Now that reincarnating soul, when it incarnates, it generates the lower mind, that is the basis for what we call the personal ego, which is entangled with the desires, and they express through the physical body, which has these two aspects, the dense aspect and the more ethereal part. So when we are alive, on the physical plane, the reincarnating soul is expressing through all these different principles, through the personal ego, the desires, and through a physical body. So this is how we are right now. So the reincarnated, you can think that each level of expression, the ego, desire, etc., are like vestures that the soul puts on itself. And each vesture is limiting the nature of the soul. As we are going to see, these vestures are necessary because there is something that is important for the soul that can only be gathered, let's say, on the physical plane. So that is necessary, but the side effect, of taking all these vestures, is that these vestures make the soul forget its true nature. Maybe like an actor that takes on a character and then forgets that he or she is not the character. So for the time of the play, the actor forgets his or her true nature and believes that he is a king or a queen or this or that. So this is the situation of us as the soul while alive on the physical plane. Now, when death happens, what happens is that the two lower principles die, and therefore, because our consciousness is coming from the reincarnating soul, consciousness does not disappear. All that happens is that now consciousness cannot express itself on the physical plane. The vehicles of expression for the physical plane have died, and therefore the soul cannot come back to the physical plane until the soul builds a new body before the next incarnation. So now the soul is expressing through the personal ego and through the desire nature. This experience in the desire nature is what is called Kamaloka, which is the first experience after death, which we explored in the previous series. The time spent in Kamaloka have the purpose of purifying the soul from all the selfish elements that the soul accumulates during the physical life, because our identification with our body, our emotions, our thoughts, and then we tend to become self-centered, self-serving. None of that really belongs to the soul. And before the soul can, as we are going to see, take advantage of the experience that it had on the physical plane, the soul needs to get rid of all those personal elements that are not in tune with the nature of the soul. The soul is a spiritual entity. All that is personal or selfish, self-serving, are things that belong to the body, that belong to the persona that is in the process of, the soul is in the process of getting rid of the persona. So this stage in Kamaloka has a similar function to what in Catholicism is described as the purgatory. It's a time in which the desires for the material, for the selfish, etc., have to disappear, have to little by little wane down, let's say, until the soul can get rid of them. And depending on how identified the soul was with the desires and the body in a physical life, depending on how much the identification, how meaningful the identification was, is how much time the soul needs to spend in Kamaloka, in this kind of purgation. If the soul already was not all that identified with desires and body, etc., then this purgation is very quick. It may even last a couple of hours. But if the soul was identified, it can last, there are no rules, but normally 60, 80 years, which can be extended to several hundred years. So eventually, the desire nature, because on this plane we cannot keep feeding the desires, eventually the desires dissolve also, and now the desired body dies as the physical body died before. So now the soul, the reincarnating soul, is left only with, you see there, the personal ego. As we are going to see, the soul is left with the most spiritual aspect of the personality. And the experience that the soul will have now is not on the physical plane, is not on the kamic plane, or the plane of karma, or the plane of desire. This is sometimes called the astral plane. Now the soul has an experience on the devachanic plane. As we are going to see, devachan is a word that means the land of the gods, and is what most religions, especially in the West, call heaven. So our series today and the next 3 weeks are about what happens to the soul, what is the experience of the soul when in this heavenly state. So to summarize, we can say that there are these 3 worlds through which we move: the physical plane, then the Kamaloka, and then the Devachan. We could say the heavenly plane, the purgatory plane, and the physical plane. And the process of reincarnation always happens within those 3 planes. The higher planes that are in the whitish color, they are not accessible and for people who have not reached enlightenment. The higher planes are connected to nirvana, let's say, to put it simple. But normally, people who are not enlightened are not aware of the higher planes. The whole field of experience of a soul that is not yet enlightened is on these 3 worlds: heaven, purgatory, and life. And the wheel of reincarnation is a wheel where we come from heaven down to earth and then back to heaven in a cyclic way. So that would be the recap of what we have seen in the previous series. So Annie Besant now will talk a little more about the nature of the reincarnating soul and some of the things that we have discussed up to now. She says, let us take a general view of the life of the eternal pilgrim, the inner self, the human soul. So this is the reincarnating soul that we have been discussing about, during a cycle of incarnation, that cycle through the 3 worlds. He has had many pilgrimages in the past, during which he gained the powers which he shows now. He is a spiritual being who has already passed out of the passive condition of pure spirit and who has evolved an intellect, the self-conscious mind. So the idea is that at the beginning of this pilgrimage, the soul comes. Remember that the reincarnating soul is an expression of the self or the spirit. At the beginning, the spirit has no mind, and the spirit is in a state of unity, but there is no self-awareness there. It is through the process of reincarnation that the spirit begins to develop a mind, what we call the higher mind, and that higher mind is the source of the sense of I exist. At the beginning, the sense of I exist is entangled with the body, with the emotions, with the lower mind. So when we say I, we mean the persona, the personality. With the process of reincarnation, little by little, we realize that our I-ness is not, that the personal I-ness is temporary, but we start discovering this eternal I-ness in us, which is at the level of the soul, at the level of the higher mind. So Annie Besant says here, at this point in evolution, we have all developed a higher mind, a sense of I-ness at the level of the soul. So we are not just the passive spirit or the unconscious spirit that we were at the beginning of the cycle of reincarnation. However, even though we have this sense of I-ness at the level of the soul, that doesn't mean that we can retain awareness of our true nature, of this higher I-ness, when we are in a body. Because when we come, as Annie Besant will explain, when we get rid of the body and the desire nature and we are in the Vachan, we realize that we are the soul. Once we put on all these vestures again, or we take on this new character, then we forget our true nature. The matter that we take on blinds the memory of our true nature. So we do have an awareness at the level of our true nature, at the level of the soul, but until we gain enlightenment, we lose it every time that we incarnate. So this is what Annie Besant says. We do have this higher self-awareness, but this evolution by experience is far from being complete, even so far as to make the pilgrim, the spirit, the reincarnating soul, to make him master of matter. His ignorance leaves him a prey to all the illusions of gross matter, and as soon as he comes into contact with it, he's not fit to be a builder of a universe, being subject to the deceptive visions caused by gross matter. As a child who, looking through a piece of blue glass, imagines all the outside world to be blue. In the Theosophical view, the idea is that the soul is a celestial being in training, so to say. This celestial being that is what we are, what we really are, not we as the personality, but our true nature. We are, the Blavatsky would say, the fallen angels. We are angels, we are celestial beings who have fallen into earth. In the Theosophical view, not because of a sin or because of a rebellion, but because this fall is necessary for our training. The training for what? The training to become a fully conscious celestial being that is, as Annie Besant says here, a builder of the cosmos. Right now, we are potentially angels that are helping nature to build, planets and systems every time that there is the manifestation of a new universe. But we are useless for that, because as soon as we descend to the physical plane, we forget that we are these celestial beings. And we assume that we are this personality, that we are this physical, feeble, transient human being. So as long as we fail to retain an awareness of our divine nature when we are expressing ourselves through matter, then as long as that happens, we cannot really be co-workers of nature, builders of the universe, as Annie Besant says here. So throughout the cycle of incarnation, coming back and again and again and again, the soul little by little learns to retain, to realize that every time that it comes to the physical body, loses its own awareness and learns to retain it more and more and more. If you are interested in these subjects, it's because you as a soul have succeeded to a large extent to retain the sense, the intuition, the feeling that we are far more than the physical body. Eventually, you will get to a point where you will know your true nature as clearly as we know our personal nature right now. And this is what an enlightened being is. So the process of reincarnation has to continue until we become masters of matter, and not the opposite, that is what happens right now, that matter blinds our spiritual perception. So this is what Annie Besant says: the object of a cycle of incarnation is to free him from these illusions, so that when he is surrounded by and working in gross matter, he may retain clear vision and not be blinded by illusion. So now let us explore the cycle of incarnation. She says, the cycle is made up of two alternating states. A short one, a short state called life on earth, during which the pilgrim god is plunged into gross matter. And then a comparatively long one called life in Devachan, during which he is encircled by subtle matter. So the Devachanic plane and the Kamaloka, these are all material planes. In the Theosophical view, there are many different states of matter, and matter is always there whenever there is manifestation. But some matter is very spiritual matter. Let's put it that way. So the subtler matter, the more spiritual matter, does not have that blinding effect, or such a big blinding effect as the physical matter does. So Annie Besant says here, in that cycle that we saw in the diagram, we have the two poles, and those are the two states that she talks about. She says a short one, where we are on the physical plane. It may last, 80, 100 years, whatever it is. And then a long one that happens in Devachan. Now, she's not going to talk about the length here, but later she mentions some of this. But basically, again, all this is difficult to give a number, a duration, or a length, because it varies a lot with people. But we can say that in general, life in Devachan tends to last between 800 years to 2,000 years. In the Theosophical view, the life on Devachan, when we go back home, when we become what we really are, that is this spiritual entity, that is our, as Annie Besant is going to say, that is our normal state. And then every now and then we come shortly to the physical plane to gather experience, and then we go back to Devachan, that is our home. In general, the faster we reincarnate, as we are going to see, that means that we have very little to assimilate in Devachan. The more spiritual we are, the longer is the time that we spend in Devachan. Of course, there are all kinds of exceptions. If we die of an accident, we may reincarnate far, faster, because we have not finished really what we needed to do in life. If we are close to enlightenment, we may reincarnate fast, just to get the last lessons as fast as possible, and we can become helpers of humanity. But in general, the more spiritual a person is, the longer that person stays on the higher planes. And this is important for what Annie Besant is going to say. She gives the example: as a diver may plunge into the depths of the ocean to seek a pearl, so the self plunges into the depths of the ocean of life, of physical life, to seek the pearl of experience. But he does not stay there long. It is not his own element. He rises up again into his own atmosphere and shakes off from him the heavier element he leaves. So you see, in the example of a diver, you have a whole life on the ground, let's say, but you need to dive deep into the ocean every now and then to get a pearl, which will allow you to live your real life on the ground. So the times that you dive in search of the pearl is a very small time compared to your real life. But it is valuable, it is necessary. It is that pearl which allows you to have a business, for example, and to be able to live on the ground. So similarly, we as spiritual souls, we live on the higher planes and we dive into the physical plane for a very short time, comparatively speaking, to try to get a pearl, and then we go back home. This is why Annie Besant will say that our life on the physical plane is not our normal state. It's the opposite to how we normally understand life. We think this is the normal state, and what happens after death, if there is anything, is something that it's not our normal state. And even people who believe in reincarnation, in modern spirituality, many times they perhaps influenced by the materialistic age in which we live, they still have the sense that the physical life is what we really are. Sure, we know about life after death, but the idea is to get rid or go through life after death as fast as possible so that we come back into incarnation very soon, because this is our true home. That's the idea of many people in this materialistic age. What Annie Besant and the Theosophical tradition proposes is the opposite. The life on the physical plane is not our true life. It is part of our lives, like the diver that goes deep into the ocean, but it's not our normal state. Our normal state is on the higher planes, and this is why in the Eastern traditions, for example, they talk about the physical life kind of disparagingly, saying that life is suffering, that life is full of limitations, etc. Because compare, as we are going to see, with our experience on the higher planes, even the happiest of all lives on the physical plane cannot cast a shadow on the bliss that we experience in our true nature, or in our true home on the spiritual planes. So physical life, as we will see, is very important, but it's not our normal state. This is what Annie Besant will emphasize. So she says, the second state, known as Devachan, may fairly be called his normal one, as it is of an enormous extent compared with the short breaks in it that he spends upon earth. So as I said, imagine a spiritual person living for over 1,000 years on Devachan, coming down for 100 years or so, and going back again for 1,000 years. Obviously, from that perspective, the experience on the physical plane is a short one. And she says, this state of Devachan is comparatively normal also, since in it he is less removed. In Devachan, we are less removed from our essential divine life. We are less encased in matter, less diluted by its swiftly changing appearances. So as I explained before, when we are in the physical plane, using a physical body, we have all this clothing on us that don't really allow us to express ourselves in a perfect way. We can use a similar idea that Annie Besant is giving here with the diver. Suppose that you have to dive deep into the depths of the ocean. You cannot do it with your naked physical body. You have to put a very heavy suit and very limiting. Your movement is very slow, it's very heavy. You don't have the sensitivity that you have on your skin. The whole suit is very limiting, but if you need to do something at the bottom of the ocean, you need it. So similarly, we as a soul have an enormous amount of wisdom and love and all these spiritual qualities that we talk about, they are part of us as a spiritual soul. But when we encase ourselves in all these planes of matter, we cannot express them. We forget about our true nature. We are unable to express those qualities. As evolution proceeds, as we gather more and more experience through the cycles of reincarnation, then we learn little by little to express our true nature. So here, the analogy of having this heavy suit at the bottom of the ocean doesn't work any longer, because it is possible for us to express our spiritual nature even on the physical plane. Never to the extent that this can be expressed on the higher planes, because there is an intrinsic limitation in physical matter that is more than the limitation of the spiritual matter. But we can express our spiritual nature to a far larger extent than we can before we realize our true nature. So Annie Besant continues, out of this normal state, that is devachan, the inner self plunges into physical life for brief periods in order that he may gain experiences, otherwise unattainable, and bring them back to enrich his more abiding condition. So there are certain experiences that we can only have on the physical plane. You see, if we have to learn not to be blinded by physical matter, the only way to learn it is by being blinded by physical matter and making efforts to learn how to retain an awareness of our true nature. There is no other way. And there are many aspects of our evolution as a spiritual entity, as a celestial being, that are necessary on the physical plane. Not everything, not all our evolution depends on the physical plane. There is a lot of our evolution happens on the higher planes. But there is a part of our evolution that can only happen as we experience the lower planes, as we experience the physical and the emotional and the lower mental plane. And then the idea is that as we gather this experience, we will see this in more detail as the series progresses. We bring that experience with us when we come back home to the spiritual planes, and that experience is the one that makes us grow, develop as a soul. So Besant says, slowly and gradually, by reiterated experiences in his reincarnations, gross matter loses its power over him and becomes his servant instead of his tyrant. So that's what we have been discussing. As the soul recognizes earth experiences as transitory and external, it gradually frees itself from them until it can move through any region of our universe with unbroken self-consciousness, self-awareness, a true Lord of mind, the free and triumphant God. Such is the triumph of the divine nature manifested in the flesh, the subduing of every form of matter to be the obedient instrument of spirit. So you see, part of the aim of this process of reincarnation is that we can move on any level of matter in the universe, on any plane of matter, whether it is physical, emotional, mental, etc., without losing self-awareness. And by self-awareness, we don't mean the self-awareness that we have on the physical plane. We mean the awareness of the self in us, the awareness of the true self in us. In general, what we mean self-awareness is awareness of my thoughts, awareness of my emotions, awareness of my body. So it is a fragment of the total self-awareness that we need to develop as a soul. We don't have a self-awareness of our higher mental nature. We don't have a self-awareness of our Buddhic nature, the spiritual intuition, and we don't have a self-awareness of our true self, the divine self, Atma. So what happens with the process of reincarnation and the evolution that is the result of this is that we can retain an awareness of our whole nature, no matter on what plane we are. And also when she says subduing matter to become an instrument of spirit, is because the idea of, for example, if for any reason we as a celestial being that is already enlightened, we need to do some work on the physical plane, then we have the freedom to build a physical body and to inhabit that physical body and to do whatever work needs to be done, and then to let go of the physical body. This is, for example, the concept of avatars in Hinduism, the divine incarnations. The idea is that an enlightened soul can build a physical body without losing the awareness, I am the divine. That when we are able to do that, then matter on any plane is an instrument of expression, a vehicle of expression. We use matter to express whatever we need. Right now, we do this. We build physical bodies. This is what happens in the process of reincarnation. But then we get trapped in those bodies. We become a prisoner of matter because we forget our true nature. So this is what Annie Besant says, that another aspect of the process of evolution is not only to retain our self-awareness, but to develop the divine skill, let's say, to build bodies or vehicles of expression on any plane and to use them as we use a car today, that we use the car and go wherever we want and not become identified with the car itself. So let's see, let us begin with some description of what Devachan is. We will look at this in more details in the future classes in the series. So Annie Besant says that among the various conceptions presented by the esoteric philosophy, there are few perhaps which the Western mind has found more difficulty in grasping than that of Devachan, or the land of the gods. Deva comes from the Sanskrit that means God, and Chan means place or land. So Devachan is the land of the gods. Sometimes also it is called Devaloka. Loka is also a Sanskrit word for place or plane. So Devachan is the land of the gods. Now she says, according to the Prasanga school of Tibetan Buddhism, this is one of the philosophies in Tibetan Buddhism, the higher spiritual plane path leads to nirvana, while the lower spiritual path leads to Sukhavati, which is a synonym of Devachan. So she's bringing an example from in Tibetan Buddhism. There are people who are spiritual, they can be on two paths. The higher one will lead to nirvana and liberation, enlightenment. The lower spiritual path doesn't lead to nirvana, it leads to Devachan. It's like, if you remember these three worlds, the physical, the Kamaloka and Devachan, and then above that was nirvana. So it's like the lower spiritual path can take us up to Devachan, but then we come back to the physical. We are not able to break through Devachan and go into nirvana. For this reason, she says, a scholar calls Devachan the nirvana of the common people, where the saints revel in physical bliss for eons until they re-enter the circle of transmigration. So Devachan is like a lower reflection of nirvana. As we are going to see, Devachan is a blissful experience. Devachan is attainable to, even though he talks about saints here, as we are going to see, Devachan is available to most people in humanity. Whoever had some level of love for something can have a Devachan. We are going to see also that the depth of the experience in Devachan depends on the depth of our spiritual nature and aspirations while on the physical plane. But basically, the idea is that Devachan is a lower nirvana, which is transitory. The higher nirvana is permanent. The lower nirvana is transitory until we are dragged again in the wheel of reincarnations, or transmigration, as this scholar says, and we are dragged into the physical body again. Now, being a lower nirvana, that means that nirvana is supposed to be the truth, it's supposed to be enlightenment. Devachan is lower than that. So Devachan is not a plane of enlightened truth. And we are going to see that. So she quotes a master of wisdom who wrote, "There are two fields of causal manifestations." Causal meaning we can produce karmic causes. We can generate actions that produces effects on two fields or two planes. The objective, that is how he in early Theosophy, the Masters of Wisdom and Blavatsky, they used to call the physical plane the objective plane. And then the subjective plane, which are the spiritual planes in general. So there are two fields in which we can produce causes, karmic causes. One is on the spiritual planes and the other is on the physical plane. The grosser energies, the denser, the more material energies, find or the causes that are associated to more material energies, let's say, find their outcome in the new personality of each birth. The moral and spiritual activities find their sphere of effects in Devachan. So as we go through life, we produce karma on two levels. Actually, we can zoom in and there are more levels than two, but for the purposes of what we need to understand that, we can separate them in two. There are some karmic causes that are material, are associated to our personality, to what we do for self-serving reasons or selfish reasons, or even if they are good actions, they are based on the illusion of being the personality or the ignorance of not knowing that I am far more than this personality. So those karmic causes have to produce their effects on the physical plane because their field of operation is the physical plane. So those karmic causes will be harvested, let's say, when we come back to the physical plane. But then in physical life, there are other causes that have to do with spiritual feelings, intentions, thoughts, interests, things that don't have to do with our body, don't have to do with our personal self. So all these more spiritual, moral, ethical causes, they are harvested, let's say, on the spiritual plane in Devachan. So this is basically what the master is saying here. So the spiritual ego, the word ego comes from the Greek and means I-ness. So the spiritual I-ness, this self-awareness at the level of our spiritual nature. And the spiritual ego is another terminology for the reincarnating soul. So the spiritual ego moves in eternity like a pendulum between the hours of life and death. But though these periods, both what we call life and the life after death, though these periods have their beginning and their end, the spiritual pilgrim himself is eternal. So we saw that the reincarnating soul is on a higher plane, this immortal, eternal. All the wheel of reincarnation happens on the lower planes. So that soul is brought back to the physical plane, then up to the Vachan, down and up, just at the level of the diagram. So there is like a pendulum going back and forth, but our true nature is eternal. And the master says, he is the actor, and its numerous and different incarnations are the actor's parts. So I gave that example before. So each new life is like a new play or a new part in a play. But it's better to think of a new play, because in one play, our character may be a poor person, humble person. In the next play, our character may be a king. And we are neither the poor person nor the king. We are the actor behind. And playing a poor person, playing a king, playing a sad person, playing a happy person, this is all part of the experience of the actor. So similarly, incarnations can vary very widely from one to the other, all according to karma. But what is permanent is the spiritual, the soul that is behind. This is our true nature. So the master says, during the cycle of births, up to the very threshold of parinirvana, this is, we don't need to go into technicalities, let's talk about the nirvanic plane. So during the cycle of birth, all the way until before we reach nirvana, the soul is bound to play many such parts, which often are disagreeable to it. So many of our personal lives may not be particularly happy, particularly successful, particularly, whatever we imagine that they should be. But they are, again, an important part in the process of evolution. Because we are only aware of the physical life, we judge our existence depending on what happened in this particular play. As we become aware of our reality as the actor beyond all the plays, we begin to realize that we have all these different parts. So whatever personality, whatever physical condition we are given in this particular life, it's just a fragment of our whole experience. So the more we realize this, first intellectually, then we start first intellectually, then we start having more of an intuitive feeling that grows into a certainty. So the more we feel that we are far beyond this little personality, it's easier for us to deal with the life, with the character that I need to play in this particular life, and do it the best way I can. We cannot be all and everything in any given life. So there are many things that maybe we would like to experience or to do, but we may have done it many times in the past. We may do it many times in the future. Right now, this is the role that I have to play, and I have to play this role as best as possible. So the master continues, like a bee collecting its honey from every flower and leaving the rest to feed the worms of the earth, our spiritual individuality collects only the nectar of moral qualities and consciousness from every terrestrial personality with which karma forces the soul to clothe itself. So the bee goes to the flower, it takes the nectar, and then leaves the flower behind, and the flower will die and feed the worms, as the master says here. And the bee only takes the nectar. This is an analogy of us as a soul coming to a physical body. There is a lot of experiences around the physical body related to the personality. But at the end of the life, we take the nectar, we take the essence, the spiritual essence of that particular life, And that's all that matters to us. Everything that had to do with the physical body, that had to do with the personality, all that we leave behind is forgotten. It doesn't matter. We don't care about. All we care is what we have been able to harvest, spiritually speaking, from that personality. And the rest is food for the worms, as the master says. And once, all these experiences and these qualities that we as a soul begin to develop from each incarnation, the master says, uniting at last all these qualities in one, the soul then becomes a perfect being, a Dhyan Chohan, a celestial being. Dhyan Chohan is a technical term in Theosophy for celestial being. So as we were talking about, this is the idea of the process of reincarnation. So Annie Besant says, while experiences are gathered during life on earth, it is in the partial freedom of Devachan that the soul assimilates his experiences. In this state, the soul is still partly dominated by them. At first, indeed, almost completely dominated by the experiences that the soul had on earth, so that the Devachanic life is merely a sublimated continuation of the earth life. We will see this more in detail in future classes. The idea is that we get experiences from our physical life, and we assimilate those experiences in Devachan. Now, when the soul is very little evolved, we will see that the soul, in Devachan, the soul continues to be conditioned by the previous personality. It's like the actor that finishes the play and goes back home, but cannot get out of his or her head the character that he or she was playing. As the soul evolves more and more, then it's easier for the soul to let go of the previous personality. And that soul can have a deeper experience of its true nature, of its more spiritual aspect. We will see that in the next classes. But Annie Besant says it is very significant in this connection that the soul can only assimilate in Devachan the kind of experience it has been gathering on earth. So every Devachanic stage is conditioned by the earth stage that precedes it. So whatever we can assimilate in Devachan depends on what we did in the previous physical life. The physical life is like eating, Devachan is like digesting. If we didn't eat much, there is very little to digest, or the opposite. So there is a quote from the master again, life in Devachan is the function of the aspiration of earth life. The dreams of the objective become the realities of the subjective existence. We will see this. A lot of our experience in Devachan are all those higher aspirations in us that we couldn't fulfill because of the limitations of our life, of the physical plane, of the circumstances. All those aspirations can be fully fulfilled on the spiritual plane. That's why the dreams of the physical life becomes the reality of the spiritual existence. A colorless, flavorless personality has a colorless, feeble Devachanic state. So the more spiritual our life on the physical plane is, the deeper the experience in Devachan. And to close, Annie Besant says, husband, father, student, patriot, artist, Christian, Buddhist. He must work out the effects of his earth life in his Devachanic life. He cannot eat and assimilate more food that he has gathered. He cannot reap more harvest than he has sown seed. As the growth of the soul depends on the moral and spiritual activities, these are the most important to accomplish the object of creation, the liberation of the soul. We may thus begin to understand something of the vast importance of the Devachanic state. So both things are highly important. What kind of physical life we have if we spend all our life tending to the personality and personal desires and personal enjoyment and all of this, we are, spiritually speaking, we are starving ourselves. So our devachan will be very superficial, feeble, with very little growth that the soul can have. On the contrary, if our physical life is one of spiritual aspiration, of trying to do the right thing, of trying to help others, all the description of what a spiritual life is, then our life in the Vachan will be long, deep, meaningful, and bring a lot of growth to us as a soul.